Tonight, we are doing something that sounds delightful on the surface and absolutely catastrophic the moment you look any closer. We are going to Versailles, not for a stroll through the gardens or a polite glance at the Hall of Mirrors. We are sitting down for dinner, an actual, formal, multi-hour 17-course dinner at the court of Louis XIV, the Sunday King himself. The year is 1685. You are dressed in something that weighs roughly as much as a small sofa. Your wig is powdered. Your shoes have heels. And somewhere in this marble labyrinth, dinner is about to be served. You have no idea what you are doing. Neither does anyone else. But everyone here is absolutely pretending otherwise. Because at Versailles, showing up to dinner is not something you do, it is something you survive. The process of dressing for a formal court dinner could take upward of 3 hours, involve multiple attendants, and require you to stand completely still while strangers laced, pinned, powdered, and prodded you into a silhouette that said, "I am a person of consequence," while every inch of your body said, "I am a person in physical distress." You did not dress yourself at Versailles, not if you had any standing at court. Having someone else dress you was not laziness. It was a declaration. The specific people who assisted you were themselves ranked according to the honor of the task they performed. The person who handed you your shirt was of a certain rank. The person who tied your laces was of a slightly different rank. Someone else was responsible for your shoes. A separate person handled your jewelry. And all of them had to be present in the correct order, performing their specific function at the correct moment. Because if the wrong person handed you the wrong garment at the wrong time, you had a small social incident on your hands before you had even left the bedroom. For women, the foundation was the stays, boned with whalebone or reeds, laced from behind by someone with strong hands and no particular sympathy for your rib cage. The goal was a silhouette, narrow waist, high chest, shoulders back, spine straight. What this produced in practice was a woman who could not bend at the waist, could not take a full breath, and who would spend the next 5 hours standing, sitting, and curtsying in a garment specifically designed to prevent her body from doing any of those things comfortably. For men, the picture was only marginally better. The coat, a formal just corp, was cut tight through the chest and sleeves, heavily embroidered, worn over a waistcoat that was also embroidered over a linen shirt with lace at the cuffs that had to fall at exactly the correct length below the coat sleeve, not longer, not shorter. Exactly. Then breeches buckled at the knee, then stockings pulled smooth, then shoes, then sword, worn purely decoratively. Though it added weight to your hip that would become deeply unpleasant by the 3rd hour of standing. Then powder. Everything that could be powdered was powdered. Your wig, your face, occasionally your coat. The powder was white or gray, made from starch or chalk, and it drifted. It drifted onto your dark clothes, your eyes into the air around you like a fine, expensive fog. By the time you were finished, you looked magnificent. You looked like the portrait of a person. You also could not sit down without assistance, could not raise your arms above shoulder height, and had lost all sensation in your lower ribs. Dinner had not started yet. You were already tired. Before you could even think about food, you had to deal with what was happening on top of your head. Because in 1685, your hair was not your hair. It was a wig, towering, powdered, scented, with violet or rose or something that smelled faintly of ambition. And it needed to be positioned with architectural precision before you went anywhere near the king's table. Wigs at Versailles were not accessories. They were status reports. The higher the wig, the louder the statement. Some of them rose nearly a foot above the head, dusted in white or gray powder that would drift onto your dark coat throughout the evening like very expensive dandruff. They were made from human hair, horse hair, or goat hair, often all three, and they were hot, heavy, and crawling with potential. The word lousy, meaning terrible, actually comes from the Old English word for lice. You can do the math on why that became an issue at formal dinners. Louis XIII started wearing a wig to cover his premature baldness. And because he was the king, the court followed. By the time Louis XIV inherited the throne, the wig had evolved from a practical solution to a cultural institution. Louis XIV himself had an extraordinary head of hair in his youth and did not actually need one, but he wore them anyway, because by then, wigs were what powerful men wore. He employed a personal wig maker. In fact, he employed 40 of them. Because 40 seems like the correct number of wig makers for the Sunday King to employ, and anyone who disagrees can take it up with the Sunday King. The problem was the heat. A full-bottom wig sitting on your head in a room full of candles and several hundred bodies generated a warmth that was, diplomatically speaking, significant. By the second hour of a formal dinner, you were warm in a way that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with wearing what amounted to a fur hat inside a palace lit almost entirely by open flame. You did not remove the wig. You did not adjust it. You sat powdered and magnificent, with your internal temperature quietly climbing, and you maintained the expression of a person who found all of this completely natural. At Versailles, the wig was never quite finished. It was merely between appointments. Here is the part where things stop making sense by modern standards. The most formal royal dinners at Versailles, called the Grand Cupboard, were not private. They were public events. The king and queen ate their dinner at a raised table in front of an audience, real people standing behind a barrier, watching them chew, watching them chew, watching them pour wine, watching them signal silently to attendants with a gesture so small you would miss it if you blinked. This was not considered strange. This was considered an honor. People traveled from across Europe to watch Louis XIV eat dinner. And Louis XIV ate dinner, knowing they were watching. The grand covered was held most Sunday evenings and on major feast days, and it was open to anyone respectably dressed. You did not need an invitation. You needed appropriate clothing, a hat to remove at the correct moment, and the ability to stand quietly for several hours without causing an incident. Members of the public, merchants, lawyers, minor, provincial nobles, tourists with good coats could and did attend. Louis XIV understood something about power that most monarchs before him had only partially grasped. Visibility was strength. Hiding behind closed doors suggested you had something to hide. Eating in public, dressing in public, conducting the private rituals of daily life in front of witnesses transformed those rituals into performances, and performances communicated authority. The grand covered table was set with silver and gold plate, actual solid silver, arranged in geometric precision, with a symmetry that required a trained eye to execute, and a measuring instrument to verify. The centerpieces were elaborate confections of silver, flowers, and candles that existed primarily to be looked at and secondarily to illuminate the meal. Everything that could catch and multiply candlelight caught and multiplied candlelight, caught and multiplied candlelight, until the table looked less like a place to eat and more like a controlled explosion of wealth. Now, let us address something that might be troubling you. Chairs. Specifically, whether you got one. At Versailles, seating was not a give and taking. It was a privilege, a declaration, a social statement issued from on high. The king sat. That was established and non-negotiable. After that, things got complicated. Royal family members of certain ranks were entitled to armchairs. Lesser royals got chairs with backs. Duchesses got stools. Anyone below that rank stood for hours through multiple courses on marble floors in heeled shoes. And an outfit that weighed as much as a golden retriever. There are accounts of women fainting at formal dinners, not from shock, hunger, or the emotional intensity of watching someone eat consummate, but simply from the combination of tight lacing, marble underfoot, and the physical impossibility of standing for 4 hours without moving. The seating hierarchy at Versailles was called the table system, named for the small wool-posted stool that certain noble women were entitled to use in the Queen's presence. The right to a tablet was not a minor distinction. It was a formal privilege conferred by the king, registered in the official records of the court, and fought over with the intensity of people who understood that the difference between sitting and standing in this specific room was the difference between being considered significant and being considered furniture. Duchesses had the right to sit on a stool in the Queen's presence. Countesses did not. The line between those two categories was the line between a position of recognized status and an evening spent upright on marble and heeled shoes, smiling. The struggle for seating rights generated more correspondence, more lobbying, and more carefully worded petitions than most genuine political crises of the era. A woman who believed herself entitled to a stool and was denied one did not simply accept it. She campaigned. Her husband campaigned, letters were written to ministers, favors were called in, and the matter could remain unresolved for years, while everyone involved spent their evening standing. The marble floor was the specific villain in all of this. Marble is cold, marble is hard, and marble has zero give under a leather heel. By the third hour of a formal dinner, your feet had moved through the stages of discomfort: mild, moderate, significant, philosophical, and arrived somewhere in the region of acceptance. Now, let us talk about the food itself, which sounds like relief, but is not, because a formal Versailles dinner did not consist of a reasonable number of dishes. It consisted of what can only be described as an act of culinary aggression. 17 courses was not unusual. Some formal banquets ran longer. The courses arrived in waves called services, each one a separate act in a performance that could stretch across 4 to 5 hours. There was soup, then more soup, then fish, then meat, then more meat, then more meat, then something involving pastry, then something involving fruit presented inside something else that was also fruit, then a dessert table that had been decorated with sugar sculptures of classical mythology since that morning. Each course was carried in by a procession of servants and placed with ceremony. You were expected to eat some of everything. You were also expected to continue existing as a functional human being at the end of it. The chef Francois Vatel, who famously died by suicide because the fish delivery was late for a royal dinner and he could not face the dishonor, is a useful illustration of how seriously these people took this. The first service was the soups. There were multiple because one soup was not a beginning, it was a gesture. After the soups came the entree, fish, then poultry, then roasted meats, each presented in complex preparations that required substantial kitchen labor to produce and required you to consume with an expression that suggested you were appreciating the work rather than desperately trying to pace yourself across 17 courses. Then the roast, the roti, a separate service of whole birds and joints of meat, carved at the table with a ceremony of its own. Then entr'mets, dishes between the main courses. Then the dessert service, which was its own event. Then fruit. Then potentially more dessert, because the sugar sculptures had not been fully appreciated yet, and someone had spent all morning on that swan. Louis XIV ate all of it. This is documented by multiple witnesses over several decades. He had a digestion that historians of medicine have described with a mixture of admiration and scientific bewilderment. And here is a detail that no amount of ceremony could solve. The food was cold. Not always, not dramatically, not left in the garden overnight cold. But by the time 17 dishes had traveled from the palace kitchens, which were deliberately located far from the royal apartments, to reduce fire risk, through half a mile of marble corridor, up staircases, through anteroom after anteroom, carried on silver platters by servants who moved at a formal pace because running was undignified. The soup was lukewarm at best. The roast was room temperature. The elaborate pastry creation was the same temperature it had been 3 hours ago when it was constructed. Louis XIV, by multiple accounts, had an iron stomach and ate with breathtaking speed, plowing through his food at a pace that suggested he would long since stop caring whether it was hot. His courtiers did not have this luxury. They ate their cold soup with the composed expressions of people who had made their peace with it. You ate your soup. It was not hot. You remarked to no one, either aloud or with your expression, that it was not hot. You were a person of refinement, and you ate what was placed in front of you with an air of perfect satisfaction. You ate your roast at whatever temperature had arrived in the room, and found it delicious because Versailles required you to find everything about Versailles delicious, even the parts that were objectively the temperature of a moderately warm afternoon in March. And so, just like that, your evening at Versailles is finally over. You survived the wig. You survived the 17 courses, the cold soup, the sugar swamp, and the 4 hours of standing on marble in shoes designed by someone who had clearly never stood in anything. You held your fork at the correct angle. You laughed at the correct moments. You bowed when the king glanced in your direction. And you did not, as far as anyone could tell, do it wrong. You navigated a building with 700 rooms, ate food that had traveled half a mile to reach you at room temperature, and requested wine through a system of human intermediaries that made a simple glass of Burgundy feel like a minor diplomatic achievement. Tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable position your modern furniture allows on a mattress with springs, in a room with central heating, wearing something that does not require 3 hours and 4 attendants to put on, maybe spare a small thought for the people who stood in that marble hall in 1685 and called it home. They ate cold soup in magnificent rooms and considered themselves fortunate. Sleep well. The soup will be warm tomorrow, and your wig, if you have one,